Tonight we explore the life and mind of Vincent van Gogh, the Dutch painter whose art, madness, and passion turned him into one of history's most misunderstood geniuses. From starry nights to tragic endings, Van Gogh's story is one of brilliance clashing with pain and beauty born out of suffering. His legacy still stirs hearts, inspires artists, and challenges our ideas of success and failure. Before you get comfortable, as always, take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you enjoy our content. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Sometimes our stories keep you up, other times they put you to sleep. We're working on a few boring ones, don't worry. Now, dim the lights, turn on a fan for that soothing hum, and let's dive into the world of Vincent van Gogh together. Vincent Wilhelm van Gogh was born on March 30th, 1853, in the small village of Zundert in the southern Netherlands. His birth was quiet, but its timing was haunting. Exactly 1 year before, his parents had given birth to another son, also named Vincent, who was stillborn. They buried that child and gave their next son the same name. Vincent grew up knowing that just outside the local church, a tombstone bore his name and birth date only a year off. Imagine what that does to a child's mind. He was the eldest of 6 children born to Theodorus van Gogh, a Protestant minister, and Anna Cornelia Carbentus, a woman with a passion for nature and drawing. His family was religious, structured, and modest. From early on, Vincent was different, sensitive, serious, withdrawn. He often wandered alone in the countryside, staring at fields, trees, and skies. Nature even then spoke to him in a way people often didn't. School never quite worked for him. Though intelligent and curious, he struggled to connect with classmates and teachers. He wasn't an easy child, prone to sudden mood swings and long silences. Some described him as intense, even difficult. Others saw him as kind, thoughtful, and deeply feeling. But above all, he seemed to live just slightly apart from the world around him, like a guest in his own life. His younger brother Theo would become his closest companion, emotionally and spiritually. Their bond would one day carry Vincent through the darkest moments of his life. But in these early years, Vincent was mostly alone with his thoughts, his questions, and the landscapes of his imagination. He wasn't painting yet. That would come much later, but the seeds were already there. A fascination with nature, an obsession with beauty in the ordinary, and a loneliness that colored everything. Vincent wasn't the type to demand attention. He lingered on the edges of things, quiet, watchful, collecting details the rest of the world ignored. Even then it was clear this was no ordinary child. And perhaps deep down, Vincent knew he was walking a path few could understand. A life of color, heartache, and beauty was waiting just ahead. But for now, he was simply a child of silence. As Vincent entered his late teens and early 20s, the world expected him to find direction, a career, a purpose. But Vincent's path refused to straighten. Instead, it twisted, stalled, and doubled back. He tried to fit into the mold society offered, but something inside him always resisted. His uncle, a successful art dealer, helped him land a job at the firm Goupil C. Vincent moved to The Hague, then London, and later Paris, surrounded by galleries, collectors, and the business of art. But for Vincent, this wasn't the world of beauty and emotion he longed for. It was commerce, cold, mechanical. His passion faded. He grew moody, withdrawn, and was eventually let go. In London, he fell in love with a woman who rejected him, and the pain was sharp. This heartbreak, along with his increasing discomfort in the art world, began a new phase in his life, one marked by spiritual yearning. He turned to religion, hoping to serve something greater than himself. He trained briefly to become a minister, but failed his theology exams. Then he took up missionary work in a poor mining region of Belgium known as the Borinage. There, among the soot-covered workers and starving families, Vincent tried to live like Christ, giving away his possessions, sleeping on floors, embracing poverty. The church saw this as fanaticism and dismissed him. It was another failure, another closed door. But in this darkness, something unexpected stirred. He began sketching the miners, the laborers, the people around him, not with polish or technique, but with empathy, with feeling. His pencil became a way to understand suffering, to reflect it, and perhaps to soothe it. At 27, after years of restlessness, rejection, and confusion, Vincent made a quiet decision. He would become an artist. Not because it promised success or praise, he had no illusions of that, but because it felt like the only honest way to express what was inside him. His journey to art was not one of ambition, it was survival, a way to process the world and his place in it, to turn inner chaos into something others might recognize as beautiful. Vincent Van Gogh hadn't painted a masterpiece yet, but he had found something even rarer: direction, and with it the first true glimmers of purpose. Vincent's decision to become an artist didn't arrive with a bolt of lightning. There was no applause, no sudden sense of mastery. What came instead was effort. Hard, uncomfortable, relentless effort. He had no formal training, no academic pedigree, and no real support beyond his brother Theo, who quietly began sending him money for supplies and living expenses. But Vincent threw himself into the work. He studied anatomy, perspective, and technique with obsessive intensity. He copied sketches from old masters and filled notebooks with his own. Art became his full-time labor, mentally, physically, and spiritually. It wasn't a hobby, it was a necessity. His earliest works were dark and heavy. Deep browns, grays, and blacks dominated the canvas. They weren't meant to charm, they were meant to tell the truth. Vincent painted peasants in the fields, old women in shawls, worn-out laborers hunched by firelight. He was drawn to the ordinary, to the worn and weathered faces of real life. One of his first significant pieces, The Potato Eaters, was a reflection of that vision. A family sits around a simple table lit by a single dim lamp. Their hands are rough, their expressions somber. You can almost hear the silence between them, feel the exhaustion in the room. Vincent believed it was honest, but the art world dismissed it. Too crude, too grim, too raw. He was crushed, but not defeated. Vincent wasn't trying to please anyone. He was trying to see. He once wrote, "I want to touch people with my art. I want them to say, 'He feels deeply. He feels tenderly.'" And he meant it. He wasn't just painting images. He was painting emotions, his own and those of the forgotten people around him. Throughout these early years, he bounced between towns and studios, living mostly in poverty. He rarely ate well. His clothes were often tattered, his health declined. But the more fragile his body became, the stronger his artistic voice grew. He was learning to speak with color, with texture, with silence. Though still unknown to the world, Vincent Van Gogh had become something real, an artist not of technique, but of truth. His style was forming, his soul was pouring out, and though recognition was nowhere in sight, a storm of creativity had just begun to gather inside him.
He imagined it as a kind of sanctuary, a new beginning, a place where he could paint the sun, the wheat fields, and the warmth he so desperately craved. He didn't know it yet, but Arles would become the stage for his most iconic works and his most painful unraveling. When Vincent arrived in Arles in February 1888, the cold, mistral wind was sweeping through the town. But Vincent didn't mind. He had come chasing sunlight, and soon the landscape would bloom with color. Yellow wheat fields, violet mountains, blue skies, everything he had imagined. He rented a small house with lemon-colored walls, the now famous Yellow House, and declared it the beginning of his dream, an artist's haven in the south of France. His plan was simple, yet grand. He wanted to build a studio of the South, a shared space where like-minded painters could live, work, and inspire each other, a creative brotherhood. Vincent believed deeply in community, even though he often struggled within it. The solitude of his past made him crave connection, and in Arles he hoped to finally find it. He painted with manic energy. Sunflowers in a vase, fields under heavy skies, blossoming orchards, starry nights. His brushwork became more confident, more alive. He no longer painted what he saw. He painted what he felt. The warmth of the sun became a fierce yellow on the canvas. The stillness of a room became a swirl of emotion in color and line. Despite moments of joy, the loneliness lingered. He wrote letters to Theo constantly, describing his work, his meals, his mood swings. Vincent was always trying to explain himself, as if hoping someone, anyone, would truly understand what was going on inside him. In the autumn of 1888, Paul Gauguin finally arrived in Arles. Vincent was ecstatic. At last, his vision of an artist commune seemed possible. He filled the Yellow House with paintings, decorated Gauguin's room, and prepared for days of creative collaboration. But the dream quickly cracked. Gauguin was independent, proud, and often dismissive. Vincent was emotional, anxious, and deeply sensitive. Their personalities clashed. Conversations turned into arguments. Vincent grew more unstable, afraid Gauguin would abandon him. And yet, despite the tension, he created some of his most memorable work during this time, including the iconic Sunflowers, which he painted to welcome Gauguin. Vincent was holding on to something fragile, a dream built from loneliness and color. But underneath the surface, something darker was brewing. The pressure, the fear, the desire to belong. In Arles, Vincent reached new heights of brilliance, but the higher he climbed, the more unsteady he became. By the end of 1888, the atmosphere inside the Yellow House had become unbearable. What began as a hopeful collaboration between two artists had descended into daily conflict. Gauguin found Vincent unpredictable, overly emotional, and difficult to work with. Vincent, in turn, felt abandoned, anxious, and increasingly paranoid. The creative harmony he had dreamed of was unraveling before his eyes. On December 23rd, after a particularly heated argument, everything changed. That night, Gauguin stormed out. Some say he intended to leave Arles for good. According to one version of the story, Vincent followed him into the street, possibly holding a razor, but Gauguin walked away, and Vincent, alone, spiraling, returned home in a state of utter distress. He took a blade and cut off part of his left ear. What drove him to do it? No one knows for sure. Perhaps it was grief. Perhaps it was a desperate act of control in a world slipping away. Perhaps it was a cry no one had yet heard. He wrapped the severed ear in paper and handed it to a nearby brothel, handing it to a woman named Rachel. Then he collapsed. The next morning, he was found unconscious and rushed to the hospital. Word spread through Arles that the local artist had lost his mind. Crowds gathered outside the hospital. Newspapers reported the incident. Gauguin left immediately for Paris. He and Vincent would never see each other again. While Vincent recovered physically, his mental health became increasingly fragile. He suffered hallucinations and memory loss. He would cry without knowing why. He begged Theo to visit and wrote letters filled with confusion, sadness, and shame. Despite everything, he continued to paint. In the hospital courtyard, he found solace in small things: a garden, a bench, a moment of light. He painted the courtyard of the hospital in Arles, self-portrait with bandaged ear, and the Red Vineyard, the latter being the only painting he ever sold in his lifetime. But something had broken, not just in his mind, but in his heart. The yellow house, the dream, the sanctuary, was now empty. Vincent was alone again, surrounded by whispers, watched with suspicion, his place in the town no longer welcome. And so, with sorrow and consent, he committed himself to an asylum. The ear was gone, the friend had left, but the artist remained. In May of 1890, Vincent Van Gogh admitted himself to the Saint Paul de Mossoul Asylum in Saint-Rémy province. The stone building, surrounded by gardens and olive trees, was once a monastery. Now it became a place of healing, or at least a place of quiet. For Vincent, it was both a prison and a sanctuary. His room had bars on the windows. There were long periods of silence, broken by distant cries from other patients. His days were filled with routine: meals, medication, rest. But whenever he was well enough, he painted. The asylum staff allowed him a studio space, and Vincent used it obsessively. He painted the view from his window again and again: cypress trees, swirling skies, golden fields. He painted flowers, corridors, and the hills beyond the asylum walls. And in a moment of uneasy calm, he painted one of his most iconic works, the Starry Night. The painting wasn't meant to be realistic. It was emotional. The sky pulses with motion, the stars burn like fire, and a quiet village sleeps below. Vincent called it a failure. The world, much later, would disagree. Though his mental health fluctuated, his creativity surged. He completed nearly 150 paintings in a year, many now considered masterpieces. Irises, the olive trees, the bedroom, and wheat field with reaper, each a blend of peace and chaos, light and suffering. But he was never free of the darkness. He experienced terrifying episodes, periods of confusion, panic, and silence. At times he couldn't remember what he had painted. Other times he feared his mind was slipping away forever. He once swallowed paint and turpentine, an act of self-harm that left him weak and shaken. Still, he held on. Throughout it all, he wrote letters to Theo, page after page, filled with thoughts about color, brushwork, emotion, and hope. He tried to explain the unexplainable, what it felt like to fall apart while creating something beautiful. Despite everything, he believed in his work. "What would life be," he wrote, "if we didn't have the courage to try anything?" In the walls of that asylum, Vincent was broken, and yet, in those same walls, he created some of the most powerful art the world would ever know. A man losing his mind, yet finding his soul on every canvas. By May of 1890, Vincent Van Gogh left the asylum in Saint-Rémy. His health had improved, and though still fragile, he was eager to return to the outside world. On the suggestion of his physician, he moved to the quiet village of Auxerre, just north of Paris. It was peaceful, filled with open skies, winding paths, and golden wheat fields, landscapes that suited him. More importantly, it was near Theo. Theo, his brother and lifeline, had recently married and become a father. He was happy for him, but he felt a quiet fear growing. Fear that he might become a burden, that the financial support, the emotional weight.
She saw them as truth. Quietly, steadily, she began to share Vincent's story with the world. She organized exhibitions, published his letters, and connected his art with the soul behind the brush. What was once dismissed as madness began to be recognized as genius. The world that had turned its back on him began to listen. By the early 20th century, Vincent's work had found an audience, then a following, then a legacy. Museums displayed his pieces. Collectors fought to acquire them. Artists named him as their greatest inspiration. Critics rewrote their histories to include him. And with each passing decade, his name only grew. Today, the Starry Night hangs in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, seen by millions. Sunflowers is considered one of the most recognizable paintings in the world. His letters, deeply human, painfully honest, are studied not just for their insight into art, but into the human condition itself. But Vincent's legacy isn't just in brushstrokes or museums. It's in the way we see pain and beauty now, in how we talk about mental health, isolation, sensitivity, and creativity. He showed us that struggle and genius are often intertwined, that even in despair we can create something luminous. He is perhaps the greatest example of someone who wasn't celebrated in his time, but whose time eventually came. Beneath a quiet hill in Auvergne, Vincent lies beside Theo, two brothers forever linked, not just by blood, but by belief. Theo never stopped believing in Vincent, and now neither have we. From silence came color, from suffering, beauty, and from a lonely life, a voice that still speaks softly, powerfully to the world. From sorrow and rhythm came something beautiful. The birth of jazz didn't happen overnight, and it didn't come from fame, luxury, or polished music schools. It came from something much deeper: pain, resilience, and joy found in the cracks of hardship. Jazz was born out of real life, and real life, especially for the black communities in the American South, was marked by both suffering and spirit. After centuries of slavery, even freedom came with struggle. Racism, poverty, and exclusion defined the world outside. But inside churches, homes, and neighborhoods, people built something else. They built community. They built music. Songs became ways to remember, to mourn, to pray, and to celebrate. Drums carried memory. Voices carried history. Every rhythm was layered with something sacred and human. This is where jazz found its roots, not in a single song or solo, but in the way sorrow was carried with grace and turned into rhythm. It wasn't written down. It wasn't created for stages or critics. It happened in backyards, on street corners, and in late-night gatherings where gospel met blues, where African rhythms collided with European harmonies, where people told their stories not with words, but with sound. In New Orleans, the city where jazz would take its first breath, life was alive with music. Births, weddings, parades, even funerals had music at their center. A funeral might begin with slow, somber hymns, only to erupt into joyful brass music once the body had been laid to rest. It was a way of honoring both the sorrow of goodbye and the beauty of a life well lived. This balance between heartbreak and celebration became the heartbeat of jazz itself. In those early days, the music had no name. People just played. They mixed styles. They improvised. They followed feeling more than form. And slowly a new sound began to take shape, one that couldn't be botched in, one that bent the rules, invited mistakes, and welcomed freedom. That sound was jazz. It didn't erase sorrow. It danced with it. It didn't deny hardship.
It transformed it, and in that transformation, something extraordinary was born. Jazz came from pain, but it carried joy. It carried life, and it carried the proof that even in the darkest places, something beautiful can rise. At the turn of the 20th century, New Orleans was unlike any other city in America. It wasn't just a port city, it was a meeting place, a crossroad, a living, breathing blend of culture, language, history, and sound. This was where jazz would be born, because no other place had the ingredients quite like this. The city was French, Spanish, African, Creole, Caribbean, Catholic, Protestant, enslaved, free, and everything in between. Each group brought its own traditions, music, instruments, and stories. And instead of remaining separate, these cultures collided every single day. In the French Quarter, you might hear operas or chamber music drifting from elegant salons. In Congo Square on Sundays, you'd find African rhythms in full force. Drums, dances, and chants passed down for generations. Just a few streets away, gospel choirs filled churches, while marching bands practiced for parades. Street performers played ragtime on battered pianos. Children learned hymns by ear. Brass bands marched through the neighborhoods, their sounds spilling into every alley. Music was everywhere, and more importantly, it was shared. New Orleans was one of the few cities where people of different races and classes regularly heard one another's music. Musicians learned from each other, borrowing rhythms, phrases, and techniques. An old spiritual might inspire a new melody. A brass line from a parade could end up in a blues improvisation. There were no boundaries, just inspiration. The city's geography played a role too. Tight-knit neighborhoods meant that sound traveled easily. The call of a cornet or the beat of a drum could reach from one block to the next, drawing people in. A single porch performance could become a jam session by nightfall. This collision of cultures didn't happen peacefully. Segregation and racism were very real, but music found its way around those walls. It was the common language in a divided place, and in New Orleans, that language kept evolving. Out of this rich, noisy, soulful melting pot came something entirely new. Not classical, not folk, not blues, but something made from the pieces of all of them. The sound of jazz was forming, improvised, unpredictable, impossible to define, and no one city except New Orleans could have given it life. Long before jazz had a name, it had a heartbeat. That heartbeat came from Africa. For generations, enslaved Africans brought to America carried with them more than just survival. They carried memory, rhythm, and music. Even in the darkest chapters of human history, they held on to the sounds that reminded them of home. And in New Orleans, those sounds endured. The most famous space where these rhythms lived was Congo Square, a patch of land just outside the French Quarter. On Sundays, the only day enslaved people were allowed rest, they gathered to dance, play drums, sing, and share traditions. For a few hours, they reclaimed freedom through rhythm. What echoed through Congo Square wasn't just entertainment, it was cultural resistance. The call and response chants, the polyrhythmic drumming, the body movements, all were ties to identity, ancestry, and dignity. The square itself became sacred, pulsing with life in the face of oppression. Over time, those rhythms mixed with European instruments, fiddles, horns, and accordions. The banjo, descended from West African lutes, found its place alongside French melodies and Spanish guitar forms. The result was a sound that couldn't be traced to one source. It was the child of many. African influence also shaped the spirit of the music. In many West African cultures, music wasn't separate from life. It was life. It told stories, marked seasons, healed wounds, and brought communities together. That sense of music as emotion, as communication, found its way into every layer of jazz. From field hollers to work songs, spirituals to blues, the musical language of the African diaspora was alive and evolving. Each note carried weight, each beat had purpose, and from this emotional depth came the power of improvisation, expressing feeling in the moment, not through perfection, but through honesty. Jazz inherited that language. It didn't follow strict rules because life didn't either. It bent, shifted, responded. It felt. It was never just about technique. It was about truth. The echoes of Africa gave jazz its soul. They gave it rhythm that moved the body and pain that touched the heart. Jazz may have taken shape in America, but its roots dug deep into another continent, and those roots still hum beneath every horn, every drum, and every note played in its name. At the end of the Civil War, New Orleans found itself with something unexpected, leftover instruments.
Brass quartets played at fish fries, dances, and funerals. If a child had talent, he could learn just by watching and imitating. You didn't need to be rich, you just needed rhythm. Jazz was forming, not in pristine concert halls, but in motion. It was music you walked with, danced to, lived inside. Improvisation wasn't a trick, it was survival. If you dropped a note, you bent another to catch it. If you didn't know the tune, you made one up that fit. Jazz didn't punish mistakes, it turned them into opportunity. What began with leftover instruments became a revolution. These tools of military order were reborn as instruments of personal expression. They no longer marched to someone else's command. They swung, they swayed, they shouted with joy and pain. In New Orleans, brass wasn't just metal, it was magic. It was transformation. And it would soon become the voice of a whole new music, a music that would spread from those streets to the rest of the world. Charles Buddy Bolden was born in New Orleans in 1877. By the late 1890s, he was already making noise, quite literally. Bolden played the cornet, but not the way others did. His sound was louder, freer, and more emotional than anything the city had heard. They said when Bolden played, you didn't just listen, you felt it. He wasn't trained in music theory, he couldn't read sheet music, but he didn't need to. Bolden played from instinct. He took bits of ragtime, blues, gospel, and brass band marches and stirred them together into something new. His music didn't fit into a box. It swung, it shouted, it mourned, it had soul. Crowds followed him. Clubs filled when he performed. People would dance until dawn. His band played in dance halls and on street corners, at parades and parties, in rough neighborhoods and across the river. He became known for a song called Funky Butt, one of the first jazz tunes ever played and one that captured the raw, unapologetic energy of his sound. But what made Bolden special wasn't just volume or improvisation, it was how human his playing was. His horn laughed, cried, flirted, and confessed. It spoke when words couldn't. Sadly, Bolden's light burned fast. In 1907, at just 30 years old, he suffered a mental breakdown. He was committed to the Louisiana State Insane Asylum, where he would remain for the rest of his life. He never recorded a single note. No surviving audio exists of his playing. Everything we know comes from stories passed down from musicians, dancers, and fans who remembered how he made them feel. Yet even without recordings, Bolden's influence echoes in the DNA of jazz. Musicians like Louis Armstrong would later credit him as the father of the sound. The way Bolden bent notes, improvised freely, and played with emotion set the tone for everyone who followed. He was a mystery, a myth, a man who created something immortal with nothing but a cornet, a wild heart, and a rhythm all his own. And though his voice was lost to time, his spirit lives on, in every solo, every swing, and every note played with soul. If Buddy Bolden was the wild flame that lit jazz's first spark, Jelly Roll Morton was the one who gave it shape. Born Ferdinand Joseph Lamoth in New Orleans in 1890, he gave himself the name Jelly Roll, and called himself the inventor of jazz. A bold claim, but one rooted in real innovation. Where Baldwin brought raw energy, Morton brought refinement. He didn't tame jazz's spirit, but he taught it how to dance in time. Jelly Roll was a pianist, a composer, and a storyteller. By his teenage years, he was playing in brothels, bars, and gambling dens, places where music had to be lively, seductive, and always entertaining. He soaked up every influence New Orleans had to offer: Spanish melodies, ragtime rhythms, Creole folk songs, and African-American blues. Then he blended them into his own signature sound. What made Morton different was his ability to write jazz down. He composed intricate arrangements for multiple instruments, turning jam sessions into orchestrated experiences. His famous Red Hot Peppers recordings weren't just performances, they were carefully crafted pieces filled with syncopation, breaks, and unexpected shifts. Still, Jelly Roll never lost the spirit of improvisation. He left space in his compositions for soloists to shine, for riffs to grow, for surprise to sneak in. He believed jazz wasn't just music. It was feeling, style, and attitude. And he wore that belief like a badge, often dressing in sharp suits and speaking with a showman's flair. In 1926, when he recorded Black Bottom Stomp and Dr. Jazz, the world began to listen. His music traveled far beyond New Orleans, reaching Chicago and New York, helping plant jazz firmly on the national stage. But Jelly Roll's importance goes beyond his compositions. He proved that jazz could be both spontaneous and structured, that it didn't have to choose between freedom and form. And he gave future musicians a blueprint, a way to write, record, and preserve a sound that had mostly been passed down by ear. Some say he exaggerated his role in jazz's birth, but even if he didn't invent it, he shaped it, framed it, and pushed it forward. Jelly Roll Morton gave jazz its first spine, and yet it still danced. If jazz had a heartbeat, it would sound a lot like Louis Armstrong. Born in 1901 in one of New Orleans' roughest neighborhoods, an area known as the Battlefield, Armstrong came into a world of poverty and hardship. His father left early, and his mother often struggled to make ends meet. As a boy, he worked odd jobs to help his family. And one day, after firing a pistol in celebration on New Year's Eve, he was arrested and sent to a home for troubled boys. But that home changed everything. There, Louis was introduced to the cornet, and from the moment he held it, something awakened inside him. Music became his voice, his escape, and soon his identity. He learned quickly, listened deeply, and absorbed everything from the local players around him, especially his idol King Oliver, one of New Orleans' top band leaders at the time. By the early 1920s, Armstrong had joined Oliver's band in Chicago. His sound was unmistakable, warm, bold, and full of life. Unlike many musicians of the day, Armstrong didn't just blend in with the band, he stood out. His solos sang, they soared, and when he began to sing too, with that growly, joyful voice, he won hearts instantly. Armstrong brought something to jazz that hadn't been fully realized before: personality. He turned solos into conversations. He made his trumpet laugh, weep, dance, and dream. His recordings with the Hot 5 and Hot 7 bands, like West End Blues and Heebie Jeebies, weren't just performances, they were moments. Scat singing, which he popularized by accident when he dropped his lyric sheet mid-recording, became a jazz staple. And his smile, wide, sincere, and full of mischief, became a symbol of the joy jazz could bring. Louis Armstrong didn't invent jazz, but he gave it its soul. He turned a regional sound into a global voice. He crossed racial barriers with his music, inspiring audiences of all colors and generations. Where others played notes, Louis told stories. He showed the world that jazz wasn't just music, it was feeling. And no one felt it more deeply or shared it more generously than the man from the battlefield with a trumpet in his hands and the world in his heart.
As jazz began to travel north to Chicago, east to New York, and eventually around the world, New Orleans remained its sacred home. While other cities added their own styles and spins, the streets of the Crescent City held on to the original spirit. There, jazz never became just a genre. It stayed something living, breathing, and communal. In New Orleans, jazz wasn't only for nightclubs or concert halls, it was part of everyday life.
You could hear it in neighborhood parades, birthday parties, street performances, and most famously, in jazz funerals. These were not quiet, solemn affairs. They were emotional journeys, starting with sorrow and ending in celebration. A jazz funeral would begin with a slow, mournful hymn. The band played in minor keys, matching the weight of grief. But once the body was laid to rest, the music would transform. The tempo would rise. The horns would dance. People would clap, spin umbrellas, and form a second line. A group of dancers and followers who turned mourning into movement. That spirit, the ability to honor pain while embracing joy, was at the heart of New Orleans jazz. Even as the music industry evolved and jazz gave way to swing, bebop, and later fusion and modern interpretations, New Orleans held tight to the early traditions. Musicians passed songs down by ear, not just through lessons, but through living the music. Children grew up watching uncles and neighbors play on porches and street corners. Instruments were often shared. Fans were made of cousins, classmates, and old friends. This wasn't nostalgia, it was legacy, a living thread that tied each generation to the next. New Orleans jazz also remained deeply tied to place. You could walk through the French Quarter and still hear the same rhythms that Buddy Bolden might have played over 100 years earlier. Brass bands marched through the same streets. Clubs like Preservation Hall kept the old songs alive, not as museum pieces, but as expressions of the now. In a city shaped by joy and tragedy, floods and festivals, jazz was the music that carried its soul. It had survived wars, poverty, racism, and even natural disasters, because jazz wasn't just something New Orleans created, it was something it needed. A voice that had never stopped singing. Jazz was never just music. It was a heartbeat, a protest, a prayer. It was laughter at the end of sorrow. It was survival dressed in rhythm. And though its sound has shifted over time, its spirit, the part born on the streets of New Orleans, has never faded. In the centuries since its creation, jazz has traveled far. It's been reimagined in smoky New York clubs, echoed through European concert halls, and blended into genres from hip-hop to rock to classical. It became a language spoken across cultures, a symbol of freedom, creativity, and soul. But no matter how far it reached, jazz never forgot where it came from. It never left behind the pain, joy, and improvisation that gave it life. At its best, it still carries that same energy, the spirit that says, I will make beauty from whatever I'm given. That spirit lived in Buddy Bolden's cornet, blasting across open fields with no recording to prove he was ever there. It lived in Jelly Roll Morton's piano, crafting jazz's first compositions while still leaving room for surprise. It lived in Louis Armstrong's trumpet and voice, breaking barriers and melting hearts with every note. And it lives on today, in the parades of New Orleans, in the fingers of young musicians learning old songs, in the second lines that dance through city streets, refusing to let grief walk alone. It lives in the silence before a solo, in the swing of a brushed snare, in the cry of a saxophone that can't be explained. Jazz endures not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. It was born from sorrow and shaped by joy. It grew through struggle and rose through hope. It taught the world that music doesn't need a script, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is to feel, to improvise, and to keep going. From the cracked sidewalks of New Orleans came something eternal. From sorrow and rhythm came something beautiful. And though the names may change, the instruments may shift, and the songs may evolve, the soul of jazz plays on,
softly, boldly, always. The morning of December 7th, 1941, began quietly at Pearl Harbor, a sprawling naval base nestled along the southern coast of Oahu, Hawaii. The sun rose gently over the Pacific, casting a warm glow across the waters. Palm trees swayed in the light breeze. Seagulls floated overhead. The ships in the harbor, some of the most powerful in the U.S. Navy, rested at anchor, gleaming in the morning light. For the men stationed there, it was a Sunday like any other, a day of rest. Some slept in, grateful for the slower pace. Others wrote letters home, drank coffee, or read the paper. Church services were being prepared. Breakfast was served in mess halls. For the lucky few, it was a chance to enjoy the beach or head into town. There was no reason to be alarmed, no tension in the air, no sense of threat. Hawaii, for all its strategic importance, felt worlds away from the war unfolding in Europe and Asia. Life at Pearl Harbor moved with a sense of order, routine, and comfort. Aboard the battleships, sailors performed their usual duties. Some were scrubbing decks. Others stood watch. Officers checked rosters. Mechanics inspected equipment. The massive vessels, the Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, and others, were quiet, alive with activity, but unaware of what was coming. Out on the airfields nearby, Hickam lie his grows, wings exposed, unguarded. No one expected trouble in those early hours. Everything felt normal. Yet just hundreds of miles away, a Japanese strike force was already airborne. Over 180 planes, moving silently across the ocean, flying low under the radar. Their mission? Deliver a surprise attack that would cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet in a single blow. But here on the ground at Pearl Harbor, there was no warning. Just the usual hum of engines, the smell of salt in the air, and the quiet sounds of morning routines. It was a peaceful moment, the last one many would ever know. In less than an hour, this calm would vanish, shattered by fire, steel, and history. But for now, it was just a morning like any other. At exactly 7:48 a.m., the sky over Pearl Harbor changed. Without warning, the first wave of Japanese aircraft swept in from the north. 183 planes in total. Fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes filled the horizon in tight formation, their engines roaring low above the water. To those on the ground, it was sudden and surreal. A sound that didn't belong to Sunday. The calm morning shattered. Within seconds, the air erupted with the sound of machine guns, bomb blasts, and screaming engines. The Japanese planes dove toward the harbor with terrifying precision, targeting battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and airfields in synchronized waves. Sailors aboard the ships scrambled to action stations, many barefoot, shirtless, still pulling on their uniforms as they ran. But there was little time to react. Bombs exploded on decks. Torpedoes streaming into hulls. Planes dropped from the sky like thunderbolts. On the ground, chaos broke out at Hickam Field and other nearby air bases. Aircraft were lined up wing to wing, perfect targets for strafing runs and incendiary bombs. Hangars burst into flames. Barracks were torn apart. Men grabbed rifles and fired into the sky with little effect. The USS Arizona took a direct hit to her forward magazine. The explosion was instant, catastrophic. A column of fire shot high into the sky, and the ship began to sink immediately, dragging hundreds of men down with her. The USS Oklahoma was struck by multiple torpedoes, capsizing in under 15 minutes. Trapped sailors banged on the overturned hull, hoping someone would hear them. Some were rescued. Many were not. Smoke rose across the harbor, thick and choking. Burning oil covered the water surface, igniting as sailors dove in, trying to escape. The air was filled with the sounds of alarms, shouting, and the steady, relentless assault from above. The Japanese had achieved total surprise. For many, the attack seemed to last forever. In reality, it was just over 90 minutes from start to finish. But in that brief window of time, a quiet harbor became a battlefield. Ships were torn apart, lives were lost, and the illusion of safety in paradise was gone forever. The day was no longer peaceful. It was a turning point in history, written in fire. Pearl Harbor had been built to protect, a fortress of ships, steel and strength, lined with battleships thought to be invincible. But on the morning of December 7th, that illusion was torn apart. The Japanese attack focused on the heart of American naval power. The Pacific Fleet anchored in the harbor. 8 battleships sat quietly in the water, unaware they were moments away from disaster. The USS Arizona, majestic and imposing, was among the first struck. A bomb pierced her deck and detonated a massive ammunition magazine.